Hi, everyone, and welcome to Conversations, a Women's Congress for Future Generations podcast. Today, we're speaking to Kristina Gaddy. Kristina is an award-winning writer who believes in the power of narrative nonfiction to bring stories from the past to life in order to inform the world we live in today. She is the author of the forthcoming nonfiction book, Flowers in the Gutter, which tells the true story of the teenage Edelweiss Pirates who fought the Nazis. Through narratives based on memoirs, oral history, interviews, and Nazi documents, she immerses the reader in the world of these teenagers as they resist the Third Reich. In 2018, she received a Ruby's Artist Award for Well of Souls, a literary exploration of the little-known history of the banjo in the Americas, its role as a spiritual device in the hands of enslaved Africans, and the instrument's legacy in today's culture and society. Her writing explores and highlights forgotten and marginalized histories and has appeared in The Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, Bitch Magazine, Narratively, Proximity, Atlas Obscura, OZ, and other smaller history and music publications. Her story about a midwife in 1909 Baltimore was a finalist for Proximity Magazine's 2017 Narrative Journalism Prize, and in earlier 2017, she co-wrote and co-produced a radio segment for The Mark Steiner Show on the legacy of one of Baltimore's most well-known Confederate monuments. She holds a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction Writing from Goucher College, where her thesis focused on the stories of doctors, public health workers, and midwives in the struggle for safe childbirth during the Progressive Era. She sits on the board of the Baltimore City Historical Society and is a member of the Know Your History Collective. Hi, Kristina. Thanks for joining the show today. Tell us, what have you been up to? We just went through your bio, and we know that you have this book coming out soon, but I know that you have also been doing a lot of traveling, and we're just really excited to talk to you and see what's been going on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, so right now I'm finishing up like the very last edits of my book. So it's interesting to like go back and reread things that I wrote now a very long time ago. It almost feels like, okay, it's done. Like, I would like just be out in the world now.
Right.
Yeah, but so I've also been working on a bigger project about the banjo's kind of earliest history and what we know about the instrument, what we don't know, why we don't know things, kind of how the instrument changed over time and how our perceptions of it changed over time. So I've been doing some traveling related to that, and that's been really interesting, just seeing lots of different places, but that all have this connection to the instrument and why they have this connection. So that's been a lot of travel, but a lot of interesting travel.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, so what can you tell us about the book that's coming out?
So the book that's coming out is called Flowers in the Gutter, the true story of the teenagers who fought the Nazis. I'm not actually 100% sure on the subtitle, and I'm not sure that we've 100% sure decided what it is going to be. But yeah, it's about a group of young people in Cologne in the Rhine Valley of Germany who, as early as 1933, 1934, when the Nazis come to power, even though they're really little kids, like 4, 5, 6 years old, kind of immediately realize that they don't like this system that's taking over their lives. One reason is that their parents are members of the Communist and Socialist Party, so they're immediately arrested or lose their jobs or have to go underground. So their families are fractured because of politics. And then they quickly, start having to be members of the Hitler Youth and the equivalent for young girls. And they also really don't like that. They don't like the songs they have to sing. They don't like the kind of authoritarian structure of that organization. And really, one of the things that they love to do, this group of young people, is be out in nature hike and just explore the mountains and these little not seas, they're like ponds and amazing like hiking and trails and forests that are in Cologne and the Rhine Valley that are still there today. And part of the Hitler Youth is like, well, you can't just go and hike on your own. Like you have to be within like the Hitler Youth group. And so they're like, no, we just want to go a hike and have a great time and sing the songs that we want to sing. And so their first kind of resistance is just dressing differently, not being in the Hitler Youth, and going on these hikes and experiencing nature the way that they want to experience it. And then as the system asked them to participate more and more within kind of at first just, the Nazi system, and then bigger into kind of the war machine and be participants in that, they start to resist more and more with flyering, graffiti, so those kinds of like active resistance. And then the most radicalized of them start getting food to provide to forced laborers and people living underground, like people who have escaped deportation, mainly Jewish people who've escaped deportation, and then also deserters or just other people who are supposed to be somewhere that they're not, so they're living underground.
Right.
Yeah, and then the most radicalized group ends up connecting with some of those deserters and escaped concentration camp prisoners, and start coming up with really serious plots of how they are going to, at that point, which is the fall of 1944, or late summer, fall of 1944, just bring an end to the war more quickly, because they know that the Americans have landed at Normandy. They know that the Russians are coming in from the other front, and they think, okay, what is it that we can do to kind of sabotage the Nazis here in Cologne?
It's an incredible story. I mean, I had never heard of them before you started working on this project, but how did you first come across it?
So yeah, that's an interesting story. So my partner Pete, he is really interested in youth subcultures, and particularly, there's a really interesting like lineage of youth subculture in Germany that starts at the very end of the 1800s that is kind of born of a resistance to industrialization and this idea of being out in nature. And that group leads to these other groups in the 1920s, and then those groups inspired these young people, because they both knew like older kids that had been in those youth groups, or their parents had been in earlier iterations. And so he was like, oh, there's this really interesting group, and I think there could be a book there. Like, I think that could be an interesting book. And he actually told me this a very long time ago, and I was like, I don't know. I don't, the difference between like an anecdote and there's like anecdotes, there's magazine stories, there's books, like, all of these things have various parts that they need to function. And I was like, I don't know. I'm not sure that would like be a great book. And then it was in like the fall of 2015, winter of 2016, I started looking into it more, and I realized, wow, there really is a story here, not only because it's really, fascinating and amazing what these kids did, but there was also enough source material that you could write a nonfiction book about it. The fact that later in life, a number of these young people had oral history interviews done or wrote memoirs, was really significant. And then also the Gestapo records from Cologne survive, which was not always the case, because sometimes as the war was coming to an end, the Gestapo and the Nazis would destroy documents.
Right.
Yeah, so that people wouldn't, see the war crimes that they had been conducting. So the fact that there was all of this material and this interesting, story that really has a very nice, natural narrative arc to it with a really high point of tension, and everything that builds up to it, was like, oh yeah, this is a good story. This is really interesting, and the fact that it hadn't been told before, and it's really not even that well known in Germany either, is something I'm always striving to find interesting stories in history that haven't been told and can kind of help us think about things we're experiencing today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect, well, not a perfect parallel, but it's definitely very similar to youth movements that are happening here right now and all over the world. It seems like it's kind of really fortuitous and perfect timing that you are really visiting this story of young people making a huge difference, and kind of thinking, about, well, why am I supposed to be doing this? And if I don't like this, what am I to do about it as a young person? And I feel like we're seeing so much of that today with the climate change, court cases, and movement against gun violence. So I think that it's going to be just an incredible story to read right now, too.
Yeah.
But I also, I wanted to kind of highlight the fact that this is a young adult creative fiction book. And I think that is incredible. So tell us a little bit about, like that process, and, was that difficult to kind of option a book that is for young adults and creative nonfiction?
So that's actually a really interesting point. I had originally just intended it to be for an adult audience, because I had never really thought that much about the young adult nonfiction sphere.
Mm-hmm.
But I did know, I had heard, on the news somewhere about how Common Core education standards are increasing the amount of nonfiction that kids are supposed to be reading in school.
Right.
Yeah, and so I kind of knew of that as a concept. And it was actually in conversation with my agent where, when I was talking to him about this project, he was like, yeah, I think this could actually be better for young adult audiences, as a young adult book. And I was basically like, okay, sure. Like if you as the expert think that is what it should be, like I'm totally willing to go for it. And so that's how it ended up being acquired, by my editor at Dutton, and they do a great job of putting out really like diverse books, interesting books that I think matter. And so I was really excited to work with that editor, Andrew Carr, because he understood it from the very beginning, and he understood these broader ideas of like, okay, it's not just centered in history, but kind of immediately was thinking about those bigger things that you were mentioning, of how young people are reacting to climate change, to gun violence, to politics in general.
Mm-hmm.
And so he understood it, and was just like, understood where I was coming from, understood what the book was about in a broader sense. But yeah, I think one of the things that really stuck out to me as I was working on this was, that one of the reasons I think these young people haven't been acknowledged for their resistance was because they were just considered bad kids who weren't following the rules.
Right.
Mind you, the Nazis were the ones making the rules.
Right.
But they, even after the war, it was kind of this attitude of, well, you weren't really political, or you weren't really organized, or, like making all of these excuses as to why they wouldn't qualify as real resistance. And you, of course, see that same argument, I think, especially with the young people who are standing up against gun violence and school shootings, of this idea that you're not making a real argument, or because you're just a kid, you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
And of course, the, question I always ask is like, well, if a teenager, if a kid is not 18, that doesn't mean that they don't have a political opinion.
Right.
And it doesn't even always mean that, a kid can articulate exactly what their political belief is, but they can still say, I think what you're doing is wrong.
Right.
I think this is morally wrong. I think this, and having that opinion and speaking about it, is really important, especially when they are too young. The answer to them can't be, oh, well, it's your vote. It's your vote that counts. You need to go out and vote, right? You're not 18, you're 14, and you're experiencing, an active shooter drill. You're going to wait 4 more years to vote? No, you have, you feel compelled at that moment to do something. So I think, this idea of how we define youth resistance is really interesting in the context of how the kids called themselves some variation of Edelweiss Pirates. Sometimes it was Edelweiss Group, sometimes it was Edelweiss Pirates, sometimes they had other names that kind of evoked a similar feeling. But in general, they're referred to as the Edelweiss Pirates. They were really treated with disdain because, similar reasons to why a lot of the young people today are treated with disdain.
Yeah. Know this piece about the kids who they would go out in nature and wanted to go hiking, and that was like one of their first kind of resistance examples of resistance that they were doing, which is awesome.
yeah and they they really, I think, in the beginning it's just an appreciation of nature, and then it also becomes that nature and the natural world become a very nice, I'm not sure that escape is the right word, but a place where they can live their lives and do what they want to do, which is like singing songs, but also having, even just hanging out, guys and girls together was something that the Nazis really frowned upon, and would say that they were all sexually deviant because guys and girls were in the same hiking group. Mm-hmm. But there's also awesome photos of kids acting silly and just being kids, but then also cross-dressing and switching clothing and doing things that just, if
you just do as a kid, and
but those were things that were completely forbidden, in Nazi Germany. The idea, sexuality was so limited of, you're a woman, you're going to get married to a man, and you're going to have children, and you're going to, be a housewife, basically. That is definitely the parameters that they set forward. So even the idea of, just hanging out with guys and girls, much less cross-dressing, would, was one of the reasons they were also targeted by the Nazis as quote unquote deviants and needed to be re-educated.
Right. Well, in keeping with this kind of common thread of nature and climate change kind of being, connected to absolutely everything that we do, you were talking a little bit about this other bigger project that you're working on, which has more to do with the history and use of the banjo. And I was just kind of wondering, when I first met you, you were researching more into the history of midwifery and public health work in Baltimore, and you've working with this project on the Edelweiss Pirates and on the banjo, history of the banjo. What have you kind of seen that has, if at all, have there been any common threads between all of these projects?
I think the biggest common thread is just stories that people don't know enough about. Mm-hmm. I think that what attracted me to the midwifery childbirth project was how in a very short amount of time babies went from being born at home with a midwife to in a hospital with a doctor, and kind of what the long-reaching implications of that are today, which I think there's been a lot of good reporting about, especially how women of color have worse birth outcomes. And I personally think that hinges a lot on the doctor-patient relationship, which is very fundamentally different from how the midwife mother relationship has always been. And so that project is still on the back burner, I will say, because I'm always, there's still really interesting things, even just about now that we're here in 2019 at the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. That had a big impact on that whole discussion of midwifery and doctors and reproductive health as a way of getting actually in more legislation about how women needed more resources for prenatal care and postnatal care. So that project is definitely still on my mind, but I think a lot of people have an idea that that used to midwives and home births, like that used to be a thing, but I think the idea of how quickly it changed is something that most people don't really know anything about. And then the banjo research, I mean, we think of the banjo as being this very American, and by American, I mean United States, from the southern United States. And in reality, we have accounts of the banjo that extend from New York in North America to Suriname in South America, and a lot of places in between. Basically anywhere that you have large numbers of enslaved people, you probably have an account of the banjo. And so to kind of, I think that history is becoming more known, but I think the context in which the banjo was played is still something that's relatively unknown. We're just finally starting to kind of assimilate that knowledge of who played the banjo, and I think now the next question is, well, why? And so this project is kind of trying to also connect these what we consider different places, but at one time were, colonies in the Americas. So, a place like South Carolina wouldn't have been that different in the minds of Europeans from the Bahamas, or perhaps even Suriname. And so how we have, are like, oh, we're the United States and we're this special place, and how it's really a connection to these other places that we're, as people from the United States, very unwilling to admit that we're actually more similar to places in the Caribbean or even South America than we think we are.
Yeah. Well, so I guess, one of the other prongs of that question is, have you, through these three different projects, have you seen kind of evidence in, with the research on midwifery, evidence of environmental impacts and on, reproductive justice for communities, and is there, that's in that same vein, a kind of thread of, how has, the climate crisis changed, if at all, elements of the banjo and history, and, in terms of like what they're made of, or, I just kind of, those were things that struck me as possibilities.
I think one of the really interesting things with banjo research is that it's, and the places I've been visiting, if they are is that those places are all centered along old port cities. So I think Albany, New York is kind of the exception, but New York City, proper, Baltimore, Charleston, South Carolina and the Sea Islands, New Orleans, Jamaica, Haiti, and Suriname are kind of some of the places that this research is really zeroing in on. And all of those places are on the water, and they are very threatened by sea level rise. I think Haiti is a place where we all know that, you know, environmental destruction has caused a lot of other issues. And the same for New Orleans, where, you know, again, a hurricane kind of fundamentally changed the city.
Right.
Baltimore and Charleston haven't had that experience yet, but I think it's very clear for people who live in those cities that the water is right there, and if there is a storm, or it's a storm during a high tide or a particularly rainy period, you know, you can literally see the water coming up much higher than it should be, or that you think it should be. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting, but also, you know, scary, is that these places, unless we do something to mitigate sea level rise, these landscapes could be destroyed. And we would no longer have physical evidence of our history. And I'll add that the reason that they're kind of important places in banjo history is because, of course, ports where enslaved people were arriving. I think any colonial landscape that you have in the United States was built by slave labor almost at some point. So, you know, the lives of the enslaved are fundamentally connected to these places. And so this is also then where you see the banjo appear in the hands of the enslaved. And it's just been really striking to visit these places and think, basically, are you cities doing anything about this? And if you're, you know, and if you're not, why not? And what's your plan, kind of, to protect these spaces that can fundamentally tell us so much about the history of the United States, and kind of how we developed as a country. So that's a really, like, it's been a very visible way that climate change has impacted that project. And, you know, you start to think about, okay, if you're talking about, you know, this place that this thing occurred, you know, how long is it before that place is literally no longer going to exist or be underwater?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's definitely true. And I think in a lot of the work that's being done right now, you see a lot of organizations and communities really clamoring for decolonization efforts. And I don't know, you know, I don't have hard research on this to say that it is a fact, but one of the things that I definitely can say I've seen is, in these efforts to decolonize communities and mindsets and everything, it seems to be that midwifery is coming back, in, you know, in a sense, you know, having more at-home births, or just kind of births that involve more of your natural space, and more human contact outside of the doctor-patient relationship. But you know, in that same vein, in efforts to decolonize even our history, you know, going back to say, oh, the banjo was made out of, this fruit or whatever tree initially, but it's just, to me, I see all of these different connections, and I think it's really interesting, and in some way or another, this climate crisis that we're in touches all of these different topics, and is very involved, even though they, you say the banjo and midwifery and Nazi youth resistance, they all sound very different, and they are, but at the heart of it, they have some very common threads, and I just think that's always interesting to explore. So thank you for humoring me on that.
Yeah, and I do think also with midwifery, it's a really interesting concept of that, of also, kind of like the pirates, of being like wanting to be closer to nature, to the experience, and also in that way of having like feeling cared about. And I think that's one of the things I've really found in a lot of the research that I've done, is how connected women who were midwives were to their communities. So I wrote a very small story about a Baltimore midwife. And one of the reasons that she appealed to me, she's right here in the city, was right here in the city where I lived. But I actually, because the Jewish Museum of Maryland had some of her notebooks of the births that she attended, I could plot those out on a map, and I knew her address from the city directory. So I could plot out how, how far she had to walk to go to these births that she attended. And most of them were within, a mile, maybe even less, of her house. Many of the women were Orthodox Jewish, like she was, from what is today Russia. And it was just a really interesting thing to think about. Okay, these patients, these women, are also less than a mile from Johns Hopkins, who would have accepted them as patients.
Right.
But they would rather go to a woman who speaks, number one, a woman, number two, somebody who speaks their language, who understands them culturally, and is also willing to help them with the housework once the baby is born, and come back and make sure that everything is okay in the home.
Yeah, this idea of postnatal care that
Yes.
we seem to have forgotten about as a society. Yes.
Yeah. And so that's just a really interesting thing. I mean, if you're talking about, using things locally and all of that, if you take that into another whole dynamic of, instead of it being, okay, yeah, even though Johns Hopkins is close, those people are not members of your community, that you're, engaging directly in the place where you live, rather than, with these external.
Yeah, it's a very human connection.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not, I guess when you say that, in my mind, makes a connection between, this very human connection, and then almost like the kind of sterile, intimidating, institution of a hospital, especially when that is not what is familiar to you.
Yeah. And that's exactly what these women experienced, and you can very much understand why, they wouldn't have wanted to go to a hospital.
Yeah, and it makes sense that not all of us, but, a lot of communities who are working on this process of decolonization are working to return to those roots, because it's what makes sense. They're drawing on the strength of their community and their traditions. And you see there's a lot of programming in native land and on reservations for women to be trained as midwives and as doulas, and I mean, it's just incredible. But yeah, it's really exciting. So I'm excited to see more work from you on that, as you kind of bring that project off of the back burner every now and again.
Yes, exactly.
Well, so I mean, the work that you do is not easy. You do a lot of traveling. It's not a guaranteed stable kind of industry. But so what what drew you to it? What made you decide that, creative nonfiction, this writing and research and hunting down these stories and telling them, what made you decide that that was what you needed to be doing?
So I had studied history and languages as an undergraduate at UMBC, and I had initially thought when I graduated that I wanted to go into museum work, particularly exhibits, constructing exhibits, writing text for exhibits, and all that kind of stuff. So I worked as an AmeriCorps in West Virginia, doing that, but also doing some archival work, just helping process archives and basically get them into a form where if people came and said, hey, do you have anything about this? You'd be able to pull it up through the computer. And during that time, I was doing a lot of writing, and I was also experiencing the difficulties of like writing by committee, which is kind of what you have to do if you work in a museum, of making sure that all of the stakeholders agree to what's about to go up on the wall or go into a video script and all of that.
Right.
And I still really enjoyed it and was thinking, okay, well, that's what I'll, go into. And then that, after my first year and I was going into my second year, I decided to stay for a second year of AmeriCorps in West Virginia. I was diagnosed with leukemia and had to immediately stop working. And I was in the hospital for a month and then had to return home to live with my parents to continue undergoing outpatient chemotherapy, which lasted about another 6 months. And that was obviously a very, it was difficult emotionally, physically, mentally, and I really had the opportunity to think of, okay, what is it that I want to do? Mortality, thoughts of mortality initiated okay, what is it that I really enjoy about this work and what is it that I want to do? And during that time, I really thought, okay, I like telling the stories that people haven't told. I like discovering new things and communicating those to people in a way that is relevant to their lives and what's going on with them. I think, in the case of museums, you often have people who are going in who are already ready to learn something because they're deciding to go to that museum.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of thought, well, it's always nice if you can get your message out beyond the people who already are, preaching to the choir kind of thing. They already subscribe to your message.
Right.
So how do you, get outside of that? And that was when I thought, okay, well, I think writing is a really nice way of doing that. And whether that's just very short articles, longer articles, or, book length projects, it's a way for people to learn something new and hopefully, and kind of internalize and not just learn it, but be able to, move forward with that knowledge. And so that was when I decided to get my MFA at Goucher, focusing very specifically in creative nonfiction. I had looked at other programs that did, fiction, nonfiction, poetry. And at that time, I just felt so strongly like, I just want to do nonfiction. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so did your experience with leukemia and being in hospitals, did that have kind of an impact on your work with midwifery and public health research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the thing that drove me to the midwifery research, I had originally thought that I would focus my thesis at Goucher on the development of the bone marrow transplant, which was not something that I had to go through, but many leukemia and blood cancer patients do. And it was always looming in the distance there as like, if this doesn't work and that doesn't work and that doesn't work, then the bone marrow transplant is basically your last shot. That's, in terms of blood cancer, that's often the thing that will save your life. And as I had learned about it, it is like magical science that almost feels unreal, where if you're getting the transplant from somebody else, they kill your immune system and completely replace it with somebody else's, and hope that that immune system not only is stronger than your immune system, but also strong enough to eat up the cancer. And I was so fascinated by how that came to be. And I started doing a lot of research on that, especially what I found very fascinating is that it kind of follows this interesting 20th century narrative where it's really born out of the fact that scientists are looking for a cure for radiation poisoning. And when your body receives too much radiation, it in effect kills your immune system. It destroys your bone marrow. And so these doctors started thinking about the fact, okay, now we have nuclear weapons. We might have a nuclear accident at a power plant. We need to find out if there's a way that we can save people who've basically gone beyond being able to be saved. And so the bone marrow transplant was thought that that might be one way to do that. And so they even in various places tested it on workers that had accidentally been exposed to too much radiation. But then, like so much science that is used basically for defense purposes, it transformed into, okay, wait, can we use this for cancer patients? Because there was also an attitude in the mid-century of more is better. The more chemotherapy that we can give patients, the better the outcome will be. And so what they really wanted to do is basically push patients to the brink of death by killing their bone marrow and eradicating as much of the cancer and places cancer could potentially be as possible, and then reviving them with the bone marrow transplant. This is also still a project that is very much on the back burner because I still, it hasn't been told, and it's a really fascinating story, and it's just really fascinating, this relationship between science and public health, and in our everyday lives, really.
Yeah, a project I very much want to know more about, for sure. And I think that you're a great person to tell it, and you do so much work outside of, your own research and writing with different nonprofits that serve the cancer community and survivors. So, I think that would be great. And you just have such a great style and approach to all of your work. It's probably one of the most responsible approaches that I've seen, because I think that a lot of people go out and find these stories that haven't been told, but then it's, it's really for their own gain, and very little, lasting effect is had on communities. But I just feel like you go about your work in a very different way, and maybe that has to do with the fact that you became committed to it in a time that you were really vulnerable and looking to find meaning. But I just, hopefully every single person who hears this podcast really gets turned on to your work, because it is great.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I especially with that project, it's really fascinating. And now, tens of thousands of people a year are saved through a process that was really born of nuclear warfare and the Cold War.
Yeah, and I am a donor, or at least I'm on the the national registry, but I had no idea that it was born out of that. So that's incredibly fascinating.
It's very crazy. But that also got me thinking, that was it. It wasn't necessarily that I was told not to pursue that project. but it felt too unwieldy, and I thought that there was somebody else who was working on a very similar project at the time. So I kind of decided, okay, I don't think that that's right for right now. And so that's when I started working on the midwifery project, because I saw a very similar fundamental concept in how do we as people relate to medicine and the people who are supposed to give us care. Obviously, being in a hospital and being in and out of like outpatient chemo wards and meeting other cancer patients, especially young adult cancer patients, was just so interesting, and so many interactions. I mean, honestly, with doctors, good and bad, and thinking about, okay, this is a very traumatic thing that not everybody will have to go through. Unfortunately, 1 in 3 women and 1 out of 2 men will have cancer at some point in their life. So a lot of people will go through it. Not that many people when they're young, but also as methods of treatment are improving, there's more and more cancer survivors every day, basically. But it got me thinking, okay, what is something that, like, not necessarily half of the population, but almost half of the population will go through, and that's childbirth. And so what is, you know, it's in a way completely different, but in some ways very similar, of you're putting your life in the doctor's hands.
In someone else's life, yeah.
Yeah, in somebody else's life, yeah.
A very intimate and vulnerable spot in both of these cases, yes.
Yeah, and you're fundamentally in this place where you feel as though you have to trust the person in charge, quote unquote, because they know best. And so if they tell you this is what we have to do, you believe them. Mm-hmm. And I had scenarios where I had doctors tell me, this is what you have to do. And at first I believed them. And then I said, okay, wait, I have to go talk to another doctor, and I have to talk to another doctor, because what you're telling me it just doesn't kind of jive with how I think things should be going right now, and what I want. And I think I was definitely in a vulnerable position, but I think that women who are pregnant or even in labor, they are, incredibly vulnerable, which is why, even just the concept of having a doula, somebody that's there to advocate for you and what you want. Because even if you have a partner who's in that room with you, they are so, responsive to your emotions, that if you say, yeah, sure, fine. Yeah, let's do a C-section right now because you're telling me that I'm going to die and my baby's going to die if I don't do that right now. Your partner is probably going to say, yeah, I don't want either of you to die too. Please go ahead, do whatever. And then the doula, I'm not saying that isn't a scenario that happens and that it's true, but the doula can be a voice of reason there. And so just this idea that doctors hold an incredible amount of power over us as patients because we believe that they know everything, and that they know what is best for us, and they know what is best for our bodies. And I'm going to say it, unfortunately, that's not always true.
Yeah. No, I think that most would agree with that. And probably most people have their own experience with that, just their own lived experience. So yeah, I think that's a pretty safe thing to say.
Yeah.
So you have all of these different projects, kind of switching back and forth between them as they are meaningful to you and as they are relevant. But what are your aspirations with your work moving forward? What's a project that maybe you haven't done that you would still love to do? Or
I'm really excited that my book is coming out, and I'm really excited to be working on the banjo project, and I hope to get that to a point where it is kind of can be confirmed as a book. And then, yeah, it's funny. I think that was one of the things that one of the teachers in Goucher's creative nonfiction program said was, basically always have a couple of projects working on the back burner, because if something, doesn't work out for whatever reason, or, if something gets delayed, then you have something to go work on. And
Right.
it's actually really great for me as a procrastinator, is like I can procrastinate on actual other it's also bad, maybe, I don't know, but I can procrastinate on actual other work if I don't feel like doing the current thing that I'm actually supposed to be working on. So I have an idea for another young adult nonfiction book that I'm not ready to talk about yet, but
No, that's fine. That's fine.
yeah,
It's
but
exciting though.
but
I'm
it
glad that it's in that same kind of genre.
yes, and
I
it
think that's
is.
important. Yeah.
It will. I mean, if it comes to fruition, it is very much about um, both young people, and I think this one maybe it might be also more about young people experiencing the resistance of others around them, and the impact of um, environmental extraction on their daily lives, and how that can both and provides a means of support for their family, but also fundamentally exploits their family and the place that they live.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I gotta just find time to work on that. And
Yeah.
yeah, and then I really do, and I think that the way that I envision the midwifery project, which is definitely also down the road, is also different from what I worked on in the MFA program, and it would kind of be more focused on a policy perspective rather than the medical perspective. So more in the public health realm, perhaps, than in the straight medical realm, because I think that just kind of works. It works better.
Yeah. So, what advice do you have for others who are looking to kind of pursue the same work as you're doing, or similar in creative nonfiction and writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, and I've told this to students before too, and especially other young people, which is you're more of an expert than you think you are. I was speaking to an undergraduate English class at UMBC, and they weren't writing students, but a lot of them, I think they knew this, but it was also, it was like, you guys will all need to use writing at some point. And many of the students there were very socially justice, environmental justice, medical justice minded.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, writing is a great tool for that, to express your opinions and your experience in order to kind of convince others of what you believe. And that's obviously a very specific type of writing, but I think to me, and I try to impress this on undergraduates that I currently teach through the Community College of Baltimore County, that writing is not just it. Yeah, a lot of people don't like doing it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a really great tool. And I think for people who are even within the sciences broadly, being able to not only write, and then this goes for students of history too, not only being able to write for your audience and your colleagues, who are very important, but also being able to communicate that to broader audiences is incredibly important. And so I think reading a lot, both articles, books, and seeing what they do well and what is compelling about that work is always helpful. And just getting out there and doing it and not being afraid of getting a no, I mean, I think that's important, but also hard lesson for everybody
Yeah.
to learn, is like, I go out there all the time and I pitch articles, since I work as a freelancer. my pitch articles. I'm like, hey, I think this would be cool for your publication. No, sorry, that's not for us. No, sorry, that's not for us. And maybe eventually find somebody who thinks it is interesting and cool. Or nobody ever does. And it just sits there, and maybe you can revise it, or revive it in a different way from what it is. But I think and it's hard. I'm not going to say it's easy to just be like, oh yeah, that's fine. We get rejected. Cool. It stinks, but then you hopefully can just like appreciate, okay, just because they said no doesn't mean that everybody else is going to say no, and kind of believe that at some point somebody will say yes. And in the meantime, keep working on other projects and pursue other things, and not get bogged down in that rejection, which again, really hard. But
yeah.
if when people told me, if when people told me no, I wouldn't, even the Flowers in the Gutter book, the first round of editors that we sent it out to, all of them said no. And that was like, I don't know, 15 to 20 people. And they just didn't see the vision for it. And at that point I could have said, okay, I don't want to do this, or I'm going to fundamentally change it to please those people, or no, let's go back and let's ask more people. And we went with, let's go back and ask more people. And that's how I found that Andrew at Dutton was interested in it. And so, if I had been totally disheartened with the no thank you answer at that point, I might not have a book right now. So you always have to just keep going.
Well, was there a question that you were hoping I would ask that I did not ask?
No, I don't think so. I think you've been a great interviewer, Kayla.
Oh, thank you. Well, I won't take up any more of your time, but for everyone still listening, if you have not currently caught on to the theme of me, pulling from people who I have met in my time working and going to grad school, that has definitely been the experience with Kristina. I did have the great fortune of working with her for a period of time. She's wonderful. Her writing is wonderful, and I'm really grateful that I've been able to see this progression of projects. I'm super excited for her book to come out, and you should be too. Kristina, thank you so much for just making time with us today.
Thank you, Kayla, for having me.
All right. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.
Bye.